Toughen up. Those are the stern words of former President Obama to his fellow Democrats in the wake of President Trump's unpopular domestic policy bill. As the Democrats search for their way forward, Obama implored his party to stand up for the things that you know and you think are right. And Maryland Governor Wes Moore is committed to doing just that in his state. He speaks to Michelle Martin about how he's going to be doing it.
Thanks, Christiane. Governor Wes Moore, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So, Governor, obviously we wanted to talk to you. You're highly visible. You're the first Black governor of Maryland, but you're also in such close proximity to the nation's capital that you're experiencing what a lot of people are calling the Trump triple whammy. So why don't we start with just the whole economic picture? Maryland, by the state's own numbers, lost some 3,500 federal positions earlier this year, which is a big number in a state where nearly 7% of the working population is or was federally employed. So how are you thinking about this moment? How are you thinking about navigating this?
There's no doubt this is a really challenging moment because Maryland has a greater level of exposure to these federal cuts than any other state inside the country. You know, you mentioned I have over 260,000 federal jobs. Federal employees in the state of Maryland, over 160,000 federal jobs within the state of Maryland. So when we're talking about things like cuts to the NIH, when we're talking about cuts to Social Security, you know, these aren't just real institutions that serve people within our country. These are oftentimes Marylanders who are now losing their jobs. And so we just been having to be very aggressive and very thoughtful about ways we can support our federal workers. And, we were the first state in the country to announce a platform called the Feds to Eds, which is basically saying if a person is a laid off federal worker and they have an interest and also a skill set to become an educator, to become a teacher in the state of Maryland, then we were going to streamline that process, cut the red tape, get them inside of classrooms. And already we've seen that even in these first months, that initiative alone has been able to cut about 10% of our teacher shortage that existed in the state of Maryland, that we've been working with our private sector partners to be able to identify how can we make sure that those skills that Marylanders utilize can actually fulfill their needs as well. And thus far, we're really proud of the results where Maryland is one of the fastest job growth rates in the entire country, that our unemployment rate right now is 3.2%, which is more than a full point lower than the national average. So I'm really proud that Maryland has really helped to meet this moment, despite the fact that the relationship between the federal government and our states has really been severed.
The other thing about Maryland, it's a very diverse state. I mean, it's got urban centers, but it also has rural areas. Right. These Medicaid cuts that are part of the president's sort of big tax and spend bill. Now, the Republicans don't call it cuts, but everybody else calls them cuts because, these work requirements, the working assumption is that these work requirements will cause certain people to be dropped from the rolls, and also just the reimbursement rates. I mean, it's a very technical issue, but the concern is that hospitals, particularly in more rural areas, will not be able to make it. Is that a concern of yours?
It's a very real concern. And this is a devastating hit, particularly to our rural hospitals. And you're absolutely right. The number one industry in the state of Maryland is agriculture. And so rural supports, rural hospitals are crucial to our economic growth and our economic advancement, in addition to our healthcare. And, I was actually just recently out in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, speaking to folks, because we just finished making a historic investment in rural hospitals, both in the Eastern Shore and also in Western Maryland. And despite the fact that we on the state level, my administration, just made historic investments in rural healthcare, we're now seeing that the Trump administration is now proposing cutting about $250 million from Maryland's rural hospitals. So this is not even an inconvenience for our rural healthcare industries. This is an existential question that you have for many of our hospitals. And that means, does a person have the ability to get not just specialized care, but just basic primary care? Do they have a chance to get that without having to travel an hour and a half to go get it? And so there's a deep level of unfairness that exists in the way that this bill was structured, and it's going to have a significant impact on our rural communities.
Is there anything that you could do about it? I mean, some states are obviously trying to develop kind of a rural health fund. In fact, there's an element of that in the bill that does offer some support for rural hospitals, but it's it sounds like a big number. It's about $50 billion, but it's nowhere near the amount that actually would be cut. It's like about a third of that amount. So that, again, that's arithmetic, not calculus. So is there any way for the state to make up that difference?
Well, you just said it best. It's arithmetic, not calculus. I mean, that fund that was being proposed is almost offensive when you look at that in comparison to the cuts that are then going to happen to rural healthcare. And the truth is that there's not a single state, to include Maryland, that has the resources to be able to make up for when the federal government just decides to cut themselves out of a process. When the federal government basically looks at all of our states and says, you're on your own, and looks at the American people and says, you're on your own. And so this is damaging, and we are getting creative. We will continue to be thoughtful. And as we say in the state of Maryland, we leave no one behind. Yet at the same time, there is no state that has the balance sheet to just simply make up for when the federal government decides that they're no longer willing to engage.
There have been a number of pain points for Maryland specifically. One is that, the FBI headquarters was scheduled to move to Maryland. It's a long-term project because it's a huge facility, and the Trump administration decided that no, they wanted the headquarters to remain in the District of Columbia. Yeah. The football team is supposed to be leaving, Maryland for Washington, D.C. as well. And one of your big amusement parks is closing. And so, these are not things that you could not have anticipated when you ran for governor. You think, wow, not to mention the Key Bridge, one of your major transportation hubs, the Key Bridge, in this freak accident that caused death and, significant impediments. Now, on the plus side, you, with the help of federal partners, were able to get that bridge, at least a workaround, up and running in far less time than people had anticipated, which has to be a point of pride. But on the other hand, these are also some real economic blows, which you could not have anticipated at the time you ran for governor. So the question then becomes how do you navigate all that at the same time?
I think one thing that the people of the state of Maryland knew when they elected me as governor is they knew they were electing a soldier. My background is not in politics. My background is actually in the private sector, and also I led soldiers in Afghanistan. And the thing that I always learned was that the only thing that is predictable is expect the unpredictable, is that things are going to change. And one thing, and you're absolutely right, we came in realizing and learning on our first days, not just of realizing the structural deficit that we inherited, but also looking at the other fiscal realities that were coming on board, and to include things like, to your point, that the FBI building, which Maryland worked for a decade and worked through GSA to be able to get it done, that I was notified that the Trump administration was not planning on putting the FBI building in the state of Maryland, not because we were called, not because they reached out, but because I received a Washington Post news alert that he said it randomly in a press conference. So this is the dynamic that we have when it comes to the relationship with the federal government, which is deeply frustrating. But the thing I tell the people of my state is this: despite that, when I was first inaugurated, Maryland was 43rd in the country in unemployment. Now we're going on 16 straight months of amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country. That we went from being one of the deadliest states where you saw the homicide rate in the state of Maryland nearly double over an 8-year period before I became the governor. Now we're having amongst the fastest drops in violent crime, not just in the country, but in history. And so the people of our state know that even when crisis comes, is that we know how to lead and we know how to deliver.
Well, also, though, it has to be said, you're calling these investments, your critics call this a massive tax and spend kind of spree. The minority leader, the Maryland State House minority leader, and about 20 GOP legislators describe the fiscal 2026 budget as a massive tax and spend budget. And he says that any attempt to couch this as a tax cut budget is just inaccurate. How do you respond to that?
I say it's accurate because numbers don't lie. I say that 94% of Marylanders either just got a tax cut or no change in their taxes at all. The majority of Marylanders, middle-class Marylanders, actually just got a tax cut, and the numbers are irrefutable. And the people who we did ask to invest more, frankly, the overwhelming majority of anyone who saw a tax increase were millionaires. And I do not have an issue. We worked with everybody across the economic spectrum. I do not have a problem asking millionaires to pay a little bit more so we can invest in having the best public schools in the country, that we can pay a little bit more to invest. And so we're not laying off police officers and not laying off firefighters. And we're continuing to lead one of the fastest drops in violent crime anywhere in the United States of America. And so, I prioritize the middle class. And if you look at what happened on the federal side, with the Republican budget, that budget prioritized millionaires. And it literally is the largest consolidation of wealth in world history. That's what they just passed, giving millionaires a tax cut so they could cut benefits for working families. And so in Maryland, I've just decided that we are going to move differently than that we are going to actually make sure we're giving the middle class a break, that we're going to give working families a break. And yes, we are going to ask people who have done very, very well to be able to invest a little bit more so we could have the type of society that each one of us can believe in and each one of us can benefit from. And the thing that we've been able to see is that
forgive me, Governor, is the calculation here that whatever the tax increase is in Maryland is going to be offset by the tax cut on the federal side, so that the higher earners are basically, it's going to be a wash. Is that part of the calculation here?
Well, the thing we know is that in this most recent budget in Maryland, there's about $2.5 billion worth of cuts in Maryland's budget. I'm the first governor now in over a decade to actually have 3 straight years of decreasing the size of the general fund, basically decreasing the size of state government. And this is the largest cut to the state budget that we've seen in 16 years. So we've shown a very real measure of discipline and modernization and frugalness when it comes to how government is spending. Yet at the same time, you are absolutely right that the people in Maryland who are being asked to invest a little bit more are also the ones who the Trump administration just said, and here's more money, here's your tax cut.
There's always the question of there's what the numbers show, and then there's what people feel. Yeah. Is your argument that these investments, as you consider them, or spending, as the Republicans would say, are going to improve the quality of life in Maryland to the point where people will feel it? Is that your argument?
Absolutely. And I think they already have, where you are now seeing, for example, in public education, where our third grade reading scores have jumped 20 states since I have been the governor. That we have now seen how public safety and violent crime has had amongst the fastest drops in our state's history. That we're seeing population increases in Baltimore City. You're seeing the largest population increases that we have seen in recent history. And so I think we are showing that you can be an efficient government. You can streamline, you can focus on modernization, where one of the first hires I made as governor was I actually hired both a chief innovation officer and focusing on modernization and really focusing on streamlining, cutting costs, cutting waste, fraud, and abuse in a humane way. And so I think people in the state of Maryland are seeing that our investments are actually working, that our strategy is actually working. And yes, at a time when the federal government is forcing increased prices on everything for working families, we believe that working families and middle-class families actually deserve a tax cut.
So let's talk about that homicide drop in Baltimore. I mean, the city recorded just 68 homicides through June, the lowest in 50 years. That's like a 23% drop from just the first half of 2024. Now, obviously, you're not the mayor, of Baltimore, but what do you attribute that decline to? What do you think was the state's role in this?
Well, I think, the state played a really important role, especially when it came to coordinating with our local leaders and the mayor and the state's attorneys and local law enforcement. We made the largest investments in local law enforcement in our state's history, that we've invested in predictive analytics and technologies to be able to stop crime before it happens. And if someone commits a crime, particularly with a violent crime with a handgun, I want them in handcuffs in 24 hours. And we've been able to invest in community intervention groups and stop retaliatory violence. The most violent year recorded in Baltimore's history was 2022, the year before I became the governor. Now, the least violent year in recorded recent history is now 2025, 2 years into our governorship. And so we've been able to fundamentally break the back of violence.
That sounds like a correlation, not a causation. I'm asking you, what's the cause?
Well, I think the cause is that we've actually started working together, and so we put more boots on the ground. We've invested in local law enforcement. We've been able to invest in technology. That we've been able to put. We're one of the few states that actually puts capital into the U.S. attorney from balance sheet. That we've been able to focus on juvenile justice reform and be able to have real focus on supporting and elevating our youth and focus on issues of poverty and employment. And so I think we've been able to take an all the above approach to include the fact that we've been able to put, additional $50 million into the Baltimore Police Department. Those type of things do make a market impact. And I think you've been able to see where we have gone from in 2022, the most violent year in Baltimore's history, to essentially now having the last time the homicides rate were this low in Baltimore City, I wasn't born yet. And you're seeing it not just in Baltimore City, you're seeing it all across the state of Maryland. So it's really encouraging results, but we also just know we're not done yet.
Before we let you go, what do you see as your role right now, particularly at a time when Democrats, on the whole, nationally, are not that happy with their leadership? They don't feel that they've taken an aggressive stance in addressing the things where there are strong disagreements with the Trump administration. Many people don't think they've been effective in opposing things with which Democrats profoundly disagree. Do you see yourself as having a particular role right now? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think my role is to do what we're doing, which is delivering results for the people of Maryland. That's why they elected me. They did not elect me to revive the Democratic Party. They did not elect me to be able to, talk about things that should be happening in other places. They elected me because we could do things like have record drops in violent crime. They elected me because we could have things like record drops in unemployment. They elected me because we could focus on making Maryland the first state in the country that now has a service year option for all of our high school graduates. And as you mentioned earlier, that we could, be able to accomplish a clearing of the federal channel after the Key Bridge collapse in record speed. I think the people are seeing that in the state of Maryland and in my administration, we don't do no and slow. We do yes and now. And we make sure we're providing real opportunities to provide pathways to work, wages, and wealth for the people of our state. And so the fact that people around the country are paying attention to the results that we're driving in the state of Maryland is very humbling. And I deeply appreciate it. I also just know that the way you win elections is by actually doing what you say you're going to do. And that's exactly what we've done in the state of Maryland.
Who do you like for president in 2028 as a Democrat? Thoughts?
I think right now, for anyone who is paying attention to 2028, it means you're not paying attention to 2025. We've got real issues going on right now. We have essentially a full assault that's taking place from our federal government on the people of our state, on our federal workers, on families with disabilities, on our seniors, on our students. And so I think anyone who is paying attention to what's going to happen in 2028, they're not paying attention to what's happening right now in 2025.
Is this job what you thought it would be?
I love this job. I love this job because it's having a chance every single day to make policies that you have thought about, dreamed about, and have a chance to see them in action is really exciting. And again, we spend all of our time out in communities, out in neighborhoods all over the state, Western Maryland, the Eastern Shore, everywhere in between. And to see the people of our state knowing that they have a fighter and excited that they have a fighter as their governor is just very humbling.
Governor Wes Moore, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Now, we know we all need our beauty sleep, and there's nothing more frustrating than tossing and turning in bed, unable to drift off. Well, millions of Americans suffer from insomnia, including our next guest, the Atlantic staff writer Jennifer Senior. She speaks to Hari Srinivasan about her recent piece on the struggle for some shut-eye and why she believes it's becoming a, quote, public health emergency.
Beyond the thanks, Jennifer Senior, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote an article for The Atlantic recently, Why Can't Americans Sleep? My first question is, how big of a problem is sleep that it requires this much attention?
I feel like that story, the name is a little deceptive.
Yeah.
That really, it should have been called Don't Feel Bad If You Can't Sleep. I was trying very hard not to write a scary sleep story, but I definitely wanted to convey the scope. Yes, because so many people have trouble. So the answer is 30 to 35% of Americans report at least temporarily some form of insomnia, which is to say either they can't fall asleep, they can't stay asleep, or they wake up far earlier than they would like. 12% of Americans at least report this as an obdurate, enduring condition. That number pops up to 15% if you're a millennial. And another way to think about this, which I think is very interesting, is that 18.4% of Americans take some medication to fall asleep, either every night or some nights. And when I mentioned this to a giant in the field, this woman named Suzanne Burdish, she wrote back to me, that's impossible. The number has to be much higher, which makes you wonder, are people underreporting? If they're ashamed, do they not consider melatonin a drug? Do they not consider weed a drug? I mean, I don't know.
You share a lot about how this is such a personal story for you because you said, then one night, maybe 2 months before I turned 29, that vaguing sense that normal sleepers have when they're lying in bed, their thoughts pixelating into surreal images, their mind listing toward unconsciousness, completely deserted me. How bizarre, I thought. I fell asleep at 5 a.m. And this was, do you remember that kind of transition from a person who got great sleep to just, no longer having it?
It's such a good question. And it's so visceral when I even think about it. I was just thinking the other day that sensation that you have, not just of like the pixelating stuff, but that sense that you cannot stay up another minute. You just have to roll over and you're out. I used to have that every night at 1 o'clock on the nose. And I haven't known that sensation for over 25 years. And I still know I can still remember what it felt like, that tug into unconsciousness. There's such a giant discontinuity in my personality or my body between then and now. But yeah, I do remember that transition. And it was abrupt. It was terrifying. I mean, at first it was just weird, but in short order, you're thinking something broke. Was I poisoned? Like, what happened?
What are some of the reasons that we haven't been able to get a handle on this?
I mean, some of them are, a lot of them are things that are intuitive, but a lot of them, the numbers are really fascinating. You can start with the fact that electrification laid waste to our circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
Right. That was the first thing. So that midnight was no longer midnight. Something a lot of us stayed up until. But let's see, 16.4% of Americans work non-standard hours, which is to say really night shift work. So they're driving home during the day, which is confusing their internal clock. They can't really, right. So that's part of it. People work second jobs. That's part of it. If you're white collar, you are going to have these constant kind of like woodpeckering incursions from your bosses and your colleagues and everyone else asking you about work. There's no such thing. The boundary between home and work is completely dissolved.
Yeah.
Adolescents, they socialize online. They do homework online. We read online. The blue light online does everything. I mean, it's horrible. I could go, but those are.
So, I was, my fascination with sleep is partly because I don't get good sleep. And I'm sure you, as a person that, you've described yourself as someone who doesn't get good sleep, who kind of lost that ability. It's amazing how people who get good sleep have the best advice for people like us, right? I mean, they're just like, have you tried, I don't know, X, Y, Z, A? But you're like, yes, I've gone through all those things and it's still not working.
I love you for saying that. The amount of insipid tips that we have to endure and all the listicles we're given. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So don't drink caffeine at 9 at night. Crazy. Or, if you're sleep in a room that's the right temperature, as if we don't instinctively, throw a blanket off if we're too hot. And also all the kind of dopey stuff like spray your pillow with essential oils. And I mean, these are not, if you really have trouble sleeping, and it's very interesting. I mean, in your case, I wonder whether your body learned a new trick. I mean, eventually not sleeping becomes a repetitive stimulus and it's a negative. And so you have to relearn sleep to some degree. And cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is one of the best tools out there. And almost no one knows about it because general practitioners don't really hear about it much and not enough people are trained in it. And for a lot of people, it doesn't really, there's also a substantial number of people for whom it doesn't work. So people take medication and then they don't want to talk about it because there's something shameful about it. I mean, but yes, agreed. And also my favorite thing is when people say, I could never not sleep. I love sleep too much. I mean, I love sleep more than an insomniac. Are you kidding? Like, I'm voluntarily deciding to forego my sleep and anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not choosing this. Trust me. Yeah.
No, trust me.
I wonder, there is, you talked about cognitive behavioral therapy in this article, and there's this idea of sleep restriction. Explain what is happening for our audience.
I will. It is really one of the main pillars of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It kind of is the pillar, and it's really hard. I couldn't swing it. I couldn't hack it. But if people can hack it, it is supposed to work. Okay, so what do? You keep your sleep diary, or you have your wearable, right? And it tells you how much you sleep. And you discover that you go to bed at, let's say, 11, and you wake up at 8, and you've only slept 5 out of those 9 hours. You compress all of that sleep into a 5-hour block. This is a discipline you do. And which means, let's say you want to still choose 8 as your wake up time. You have to go to bed at 3. And that's it. You are allowed only those 5 hours in bed. That is it. And once you have slept a majority of those hours, you still have to do it 2 more nights. And only after you've done it for 3 nights, then you can reward yourself with 15 more minutes of sleep. And you have to do that for 3 nights. And then you get to add 15. So it's really hard because your sleep doesn't just contract obligingly like an accordion into a case. It's really hard to do. And it makes you really hysterical with exhaustion if you can't pull it off.
Well, as you describe this process, I can hear people in the audience who have trouble sleeping saying, oh my God, that sounds like the most anxiety-inducing things on earth, because part of the problem so many people have falling asleep is when they don't fall asleep, they're thinking about not falling asleep. And then all of a sudden they're checking their watch. Oh my God, it's not 5 hours. Now it's 4.5. Oh no, I only have 3 hours left. How am I going to? And then they're thinking about the next day and how their life is going to be a wreck. And I mean, there's just, so I wonder how much of sleep is our physiological need to rest, right? And then are sort of managing all the psychology around it to allow our brain to relax.
You are exactly right. In fact, you have isolated what basically keeps insomnia airborne, if that's the right way. It doesn't matter what lofted it. I mean, at a certain point, whatever the precipitating factor, if you can even figure out what it is, kind of becomes beside the point, because you start doing insomnia math, as you've said. Oh my God, now I've got 5 hours, now I've got 4, now I've got 3. And part of what the behavioral component of cognitive behavioral therapy is to not look at your watch. What they sometimes say when you're doing sleep restriction is you take a medication in order to make sure that you do fall asleep at the prescribed hour. And people are often very reluctant to do that. But if you only take it for a short period of time, it's pretty easy to wean. I mean, you can wean. In fact, you can wean at any time, really. You just have to taper slowly and under the supervision of a doctor. And the idea is that you build up enough sleep pressure if you do this. So that is one. I refused to take sleep medication. I was so afraid of it. And it just made me worse. But for all the reasons you said, right? So you have to manage your actual anxiety about sleeping and fact check your beliefs. I mean, will you really not function the next day? Will you really get fired? Or will you just be really bad at your job for a day or two? You know what I mean? You have to sort of right-size your beliefs.
And I also wonder whether there's this sort of connection, which way the connection is between the anxiety that the lack of sleep is giving you and depression, because there's a lot of overlap for people who seem depressed. They say, well, I can't sleep because of the depression. And then some people are like, well, I think I'm getting depressed because I can't sleep. Which way is it?
I'm so glad you asked that. That is one of the things I found most fascinating about my research on this. The most recent wave of studies seem to suggest that actually, of course, they're bidirectional, as any analyst or clinician would say. But It used to be that if you fell asleep for some kind of mysterious reason, just this idiopathic onset of sleeplessness, they would say, oh, it's depression in disguise. You're probably depressed and you don't know it. This is how it's manifesting. It's what I was told. And I kept looking at people and saying, you don't understand. My day, my week is no different from the week, month, 2 months I've had before. There's nothing different. And everyone insisted I was depressed. Now the thought is actually that sleeplessness more often causes depression than vice versa. Now, depression can certainly cause sleeplessness, but there's a thought that it more often is the reverse. It certainly predicts depression in a way that depression does not quite predict sleeplessness as consistently.
Maybe in America, we're in a place where there's a larger conversation about mental health. There's maybe a little less stigma around taking antidepressants. Have we been kind of scared away from pharmacological solutions around sleep?
So I'm very glad you asked that, because I do think that, unlike, people are very free with saying that they're on their Prozac or whatever, but people don't like to talk about whether they take things for sleep. And a lot of people do. And the question is why there's so much shame around it when, as you said, with some lifestyle alterations, perhaps people wouldn't need statins. Maybe they wouldn't need their Ozempic, which everyone considers miraculous. They wouldn't need their hypertension drugs. And no one says that they're addicted to them. But people still say that they're addicted to their sleeping pills, and they call them drugs as opposed to medication. Often there's this kind of stench of stigma surrounding it. And I think some of it is cultural. And also there's a difference between dependence and addiction. People are taking this because they're seeking relief. And contrary to what most people think, most people don't go beyond their prescribed doses, even though they're on it for years. A Danish study showed only 7%. That's not much. Melatonin in the high doses that we have here in the United States, 3 milligrams, 5 milligrams, even 2, that's regulated. You can only get that by prescription in many European countries. So it's really interesting. People take it without realizing that it's really a circadian signaling hormone. It's good for jet lag. It's probably good for shift workers. It sort of tells people when to go to bed.
We have heard for so long, you need 8 hours of sleep. Right? As you went and talked to all these different researchers, I mean, what were the kind of things that they said, yeah, you don't have to worry about that. That thing that you've heard for 20 years, that's not supported by the science that I'm doing, or maybe you should think about this or that more.
Right. So I asked every single researcher I interviewed, tell me the dogma about sleep that you think ought to be debunked or that you think is just totally wrong. And 8 hours came up the most. So I'm glad you mentioned it, because there are a number of analyses, many, that say that really the right amount is 6.5 to 7.4. And it's tricky to do, because what it is those numbers are associated with the best health outcomes. But what that means, you don't know why people are sleeping more. Maybe it's because you can only control for the things you can control for. You can control for age, for weight, for, I'm trying to think besides, sex, do you smoke? But, the pre-existing conditions that you might know of, although it's hard to control for all of them. So it's a little hard, but there are many studies that say 7. There are many that say 7. Also, this is going to change over the course of a lifetime. Older people don't sleep as well as younger people. They just don't. And they have more broken sleep. They just do. So when people who are 75 come into a sleep clinic and say, I'm not sleeping 8 hours, the clinicians have to look at them and say, well, I hate to break it to you, but at this age, you're probably not gonna.
Okay, so here you are, 25 years later. You have literally thrown the kitchen sink at this. You've tried acupuncture and acupressure and cognitive behavioral therapy and drugs and everything else. So what's your suggestion for who to reach out to? Because, as you describe in this story, I mean, the infrastructure is uneven and the experts might differ in their opinions.
Right. It's a great question. And certainly some people need sleep studies overnight. Maybe they have apnea. There's all sorts of things that they could. You're right. I would say to people, number one, if it's been a persistent condition, get yourself on a list for a sleep clinic to see, yes, if they can give you cognitive behavioral therapy. If you feel like you're taking meds and they're raging out of control, they may be able to help you manage them, taper them, reassess what you're taking, see if it's conflicting. There are apps. There was two developed by the DoD and the VA that are one is kind of, and one doesn't include sleep restriction and one does. I can't remember what the name is, but if you just type in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia on Google and you write Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs, you will find two apps and you will be able to see very quickly which one has the draconian sleep restriction one, and it is in fact the one you want, and that will be available to you immediately. Acupuncture is great. It doesn't, it just relaxes you. I would say that meditation does help.
Yeah.
It does.
Jennifer Senior, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for, well, one, turning your personal nightmare into something that people can learn from and writing about this. And thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.
Now, President Trump says he has no plans to fire the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, despite the Justice Department's criminal investigation against him over a $2.5 billion renovation project of the central bank. Powell hit back, saying the move is political retribution for not following Trump's orders to cut interest rates. Trump denies any prior knowledge of the inquiry, and Powell has garnered support from fellow central bankers and Republican lawmakers, too. Co-anchor of CNBC Squawk Box, Andrew Ross Sorkin, joins Walter Isaacson now to discuss the threat to the bank's independence with this unprecedented investigation.
Thank you, Chris John and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So earlier this week, I wake up as I usually do to your Deal Book newsletter, and there was a sentence that sort of jolted me more than my chicory coffee. It was right after Fed Chair Jay Powell released a video saying he was under criminal investigation, and you wrote, "There are certain moments that deserve extra reflection. Today is one of them." Why is this such a big deal?
You know, I think for the last year that we've watched this administration, we've seen all sorts of elements of what might be described as lawfare and questions about that. You know, there's also been questions about the independence of the Federal Reserve for the last year, as the president has made it clear that Jay Powell is his enemy and somebody he would like to fire and push out. And I think this was one of those moments, especially within the business world, that was different. It's been one thing in the past, in history, there have been moments when presidents have been quite critical, more than critical publicly, about the head of the Federal Reserve and the acts of the Federal Reserve. But this was different. This is the very idea of potentially prosecuting on a criminal basis the head of the Federal Reserve. And it comes at a moment when the public and the markets look at that and say that it appears to be a coercive act, which is to say, to force Jay Powell to lower interest rates or to otherwise leave from his term before his term is over. And I've long waited thinking, is a moment like this going to even come? And by the way, when a moment like this comes, what is going to happen next? Will political leaders, will business leaders stand up and say something?
And have they?
It's been interesting. There have been a number of folks, both in the Republican Party, in the Senate, that have broken with this president over this issue and done so publicly. All of the living former Fed chairs that have been in this role came out and condemned this action and this investigation and supported Jay Powell. Similarly, a number of former Treasury secretaries, including Henry Paulson, a Republican, said the same thing. And then most recently, we heard from Jamie Dimon, one of the most influential bank CEOs in America, publicly support Jay Powell and the independence of the Fed as well. So I think you are actually seeing some voice to this, and not just some voice to this from the individuals themselves, but even the market has had a voice of a sort, insofar as when this first became public on Sunday evening, the markets moved and did so negatively in reaction to it.
When this happened in 2018, when Trump was saying, I'm going to fire Powell, the markets moved a whole lot. Tell me, though, what's really happening now in the markets? Is it going down a bit? Maybe Bitcoin or gold is doing something, but are they really reacting?
Well, I think there's a combination of things. One is there's been a numbing. There's been a numbing effect in terms of just so many norms that have been shattered. To some degree, I think that people in the market don't flinch the way they might have in the past. The other element is, in part because we've seen such a vocal reaction, I think the markets have settled themselves and said, well, maybe in fact there won't be a quote unquote prosecution of Jay Powell. There has been commentary from some senators, Republican senators in Washington. They may even hold up the next nominee from Trump to be the head of the Fed, unless this investigation ends in some kind of very quick way. So I do think the markets are taking some solace from that in the context of what does the independence of the Fed look like?
Well, you said that some Republicans are pushing back and saying they may hold up nominees. The really big one is Tom Tillis of North Carolina. A few others, Senator Kennedy from my home state of Louisiana, others have said it. But Tom Tillis was very strong. Let me read some of it, which is, if there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none. And then he said the credibility of the Justice Department is the one that's in trouble and that he's going to hold things up. Do you think this means the dam may be breaking, that this notion that Republican senators haven't stood up to Trump might be ending?
I don't know. This could be a very idiosyncratic moment. Tillis is not running for re-election, in part because he's fed up with what's happened in Washington. And so he has potentially more license, if you will, than others to perhaps speak his mind. There's also been some reporting just in the past 24 hours from the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere that the president was putting pressure on Pam Bondi and other members of the Department of Justice to try to exact the kind of cases and bring the kinds of cases and do the work that he's been pushing for and demonstrating his frustration about that. And some people have been led to believe that perhaps some of those conversations, in fact, led to the beginning of this investigation in terms of subpoenas being sent and the like.
Let's follow that up. Well, you just said it may be the pressure. Was that what happened in this investigation with the U.S. attorney who's close to Trump?
I think we don't know the answer yet. Thus far, the president, and I should say this as clearly as he has said it, he says that he did not know about this investigation, that he had not spoken with the Department of Justice about this investigation and learned of it like everybody else. I cannot verify that. I do not know if that is the case, but I think it is clear that we've heard his public commentary about Jay Powell over these past months. And not just that, we've also seen and heard the kind of close relationship and back and forth he has had with different people who work within the Department of Justice. So I think there are still questions about, what led to this in truth, and whether the president specifically said to his colleagues at the Department of Justice, please go do this, or they felt pressure to do it to appease him. They may be one and the same in the end.
Well, let's be clear what Chairman Powell thinks. I mean, what he said was the threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. So he's pretty clear. And doesn't it make sense that he kind of knows why this is happening?
Well, look, there's two views of his decision to publicly release that video, which is really unprecedented for a Federal Reserve chair. One is that indeed, in fact, he very much believes that this is lawfare and that this is being used as a coercive effort to push him out early or to influence how he reacts. And there is another view that his decision to go public in such a way is to shape perhaps the narrative. And obviously the president and the Department of Justice have suggested that they believe that they are bringing this case in good faith, or this investigation, I should say, in good faith. They have said that they sent two letters or communications to the Federal Reserve. I believe those communications happened in December, asking for more information, and did not receive anything.
Yeah, but I mean, this is just something about a construction of a building. This is not a criminal case that seems to make sense.
Well, that's the thing. Look, there are lots of different avenues for the American public and Congress and others to hold the Federal Reserve and other institutions in the United States accountable, if you will, for spending. So if the issue is how are they spending the money, clearly in this case, there is demonstrable evidence that it is something like $700 million over budget. If there was evidence that this was being misused and lied about, you don't have to have a criminal investigation to find out more. You could hold hearings. You could have auditors go in. There are other things you can do. A criminal investigation is a very specific thing to do and carries enormous consequences.
How do you think this might affect interest rates in the Fed, what it's going to do later in the month?
Oh, goodness. In truth, I actually think this is creating potentially more independence for the Fed, at least temporarily, insofar that there could be a backlash. I think there are members of the Fed and also, by the way, other central bankers from around the world that have now come out in support of Jay Powell and this Federal Reserve. So the idea of trying to either kick him out or change his view, I think, in fact, it will be strengthened to some degree. And not only was there an expectation that Jay Powell would leave his seat in May as the chair, but there was also the possibility that he would retire from the board entirely. He could stay on as a governor, and in fact, perhaps because of what's just happened, it may be more likely that he does stay on for some period of time.
Let me ask you the most basic question. Why shouldn't the president be able to help decide what interest rates are? Why should the Fed be totally independent? Why shouldn't we have some political control where we decide to hold the president accountable if there's inflation?
I think in the end, history has demonstrated that you need to have an independent Federal Reserve, in part because they are setting interest rates, and they need to be able to do so without fear or favor, without trying to get whoever's in office elected by lowering interest rates temporarily or raising interest rates temporarily. And even more importantly than that, I would actually argue in a crisis, in a panic moment, having written about 1929 and having written about 2008, and even what the Federal Reserve ultimately did during the pandemic, oftentimes the Federal Reserve has to do things that are uniquely politically unpopular and unpalatable. The bailouts in 2008, I know there's lots of debate about that, but ultimately, arguably, it helped keep the country from really getting into a long depression. Similarly, during the pandemic, there was an effort to really throw money at the problem, which could have been politically unpalatable in that moment. And yet you need a Federal Reserve that's willing to do things without fear that the President of the United States or any other politician is going to be trying to, move the dials.
In your book, 1929, you have a lot of wonderful characters, but one of them is Senator Carter Glass of Virginia, who helps create the Fed. Tell me about the compromises done that created the Fed and why that either makes it stronger or more vulnerable today.
Well, so one of the keys to the Federal Reserve was to have an important and central office in Washington, but was also to have regional offices around the country so that Wall Street didn't take over, didn't have more power. That was critical. And the independence piece was also critical, and they were aware of that because they understood that there were going to be decisions that at times were going to be politically unpopular. And when you really dig in and even think about the crash of 1929 and look at the fact that, frankly, the Fed did not act perhaps the way they should have, one of the reasons for that, arguably, if you read some of the diaries and notes and memos of the members of the board during that period, was because of political pressure. Because the Federal Reserve was such a new entity, born in 1913, still considered an experiment of sorts, there was a worry that if they actually raised interest rates to try to tamp down speculation, that they could tip the economy over and they would get blamed. And not just that they get blamed, but that the entire experiment would be eliminated.
Tell me about what we can learn from overseas. I know that the Turkish president has interfered with his central bank. Is that a warning sign for us?
There's no question that there have been a whole number of instances where you've seen certain countries, some of which have been described as banana republics and others, where the head of state effectively has tried to manage the economy and manage their central bank. And in some of those cases, you have seen massive inflation spikes, in part because the investor class says this is not as trustworthy a borrower as we thought, given that the controls are not independent.
Let me ask you a separate thing, which is the cap on credit card interest rates. How does that play into this, and is this causing Wall Street to have more agita?
Well, this is a separate but very complicated issue. It comes against the backdrop of the watchword of the day in our economy, which is affordability. And the President of the United States really taking a page, frankly, from the Democrats. In fact, President Trump almost teaming up to some degree with Elizabeth Warren in this case to suggest that banks should cap their credit card rates at 10% as a way to try to make things more affordable for Americans, so those that are not able to pay off their monthly bills are not being charged 15, 20, in some cases as much as 30 or more percent each month. Now, there's a battle going on here because while it sounds on the headline, oh, it's going to be capped at 10%, that sounds good. There are real questions in the marketplace right now, and a lot of what the banks are saying is it could really eliminate or reduce the amount of credit that's available to borrowers, which is to say that the banks may cut off certain customers because they would find them to be, quote unquote, unprofitable and couldn't make the economics of those credit cards work.
Well, all of this ties in, it seems to me, to sort of a more populist Donald Trump talking about affordability like Democrats have been doing, and that even comes to the question of corporate buying of housing. Is this all of a piece of a new Donald Trump?
Oh, I think that there's a line running through all of these things. I think it's the piece on credit cards. It's trying to eliminate big private equity companies from buying homes and then turning around and trying to sell or rent them to individuals to try to keep prices lower there. Even an effort to eliminate or reduce the number of stock buybacks that take place in dividends in the country. So there is a move afoot that actually looks a lot like what some Democrats have supported for a very, very long time, and is an interesting, in terms of the timing, ahead of the midterms.
And it's all part of a populist piece. And do you think this will finally change President Trump's relationship with the people you cover, the people in the backdrop of you right there, which is basically Wall Street, the markets, business, and corporate America?
So that's where I'm less clear. I will say, in this moment where the Republicans control the White House, Congress, and the Senate, there's always a question of who is the governor, if you will, over the President of the United States. And from my vantage point, actually, the market has been perhaps one of the only real governors over the president. And I say that because if you remember last April, quote unquote, Liberation Day, the day that the president announced his tariff plan, the bond market really reacted negatively, and then he pulled back. Again, in the fall, we had a similar situation. He talked about much higher tariffs for China. The market reacted and he pulled back. There are very few times and very few people on an individual level in Washington or elsewhere that seem to have forced the hand of the president the way the markets have.
Andrew Ross Sorkin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, the New Yorker magazine turns 100, and it is celebrating in style with a new Netflix documentary that takes us behind the scenes, which follows staff as they produce the anniversary issue. From seminal pieces such as John Hersey's 1946 Hiroshima Report to satirical cartoons, the magazine has been a pillar of quality journalism and has remained so relevant for 100 years. Here's a clip from the trailer.
I think almost everyone who works at the New Yorker is obsessed in some way.
It's a little bit like whack-a-mole. You think you're done, but all these little things keep popping up.
We fact-check everything that is published in the magazine.
Yes, cartoons get fact-checked.
The cats' names are Tiger, Loverboy, and Gummy Bear. Is that correct?
People want fairness and fact-checking, and they also want some media outlets that aren't knuckling under.
A cover needs to speak to the moment, but also be a timeless piece of art.
David Remnick is the New Yorker's longtime editor, and he's joining Walter Isaacson to reflect on its precarious beginning to its significance today.
Thank you, Christian, and David Remnick, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Walter.
For the 100th anniversary of the New Yorker, you had Netflix come do a documentary on you putting together the 100th anniversary issue. And one of the things in the show is they asked celebrities to say little vignettes about when was the first time you encountered the New Yorker. Let us show the clip, and then I'm going to ask you that question.
We actually didn't have very much money, but we did have a New Yorker subscription.
I think the first time I heard about the New Yorker was on Seinfeld. They had a great episode where Elaine did not understand one of the cartoon captions.
You know, I grew up in New Jersey and was very kind of like starry-eyed about all things New York. The first time I ever heard of the New Yorker and understood it to be this important magazine was in an episode of the animated show The Critic. Bravo, Mrs. S. And I remember just thinking, oh, that's the New Yorker. It's this important thing.
I don't know how I knew about it, but it's just there. It's just one of those institutions. It's like saying, like, when did you first hear about the Statue of Liberty?
So let me ask you, when did you first encounter the New Yorker?
In my father's office. My father was a dentist in suburban New Jersey, had a very small practice, and on Saturdays and Sundays, it was obviously closed, and I'd go down and read Highlights magazine and Time magazine and Life and Look, and I encountered this thing that I didn't understand very readily. There was a magazine that had drawings on the cover and gag cartoons, and in those days, lots of advertisements. And I didn't quite get it, Walter, to be honest with you. And even when I was a teenager, my favorite magazines were the infinitely cooler Rolling Stone, and I liked the Village Voice a lot. Esquire was where this was all happening. I got to the New Yorker and got to understand it and get a feel for it when I had a teacher in college who wrote for the New Yorker.
And that would be, of course, John McPhee, right?
That's right. John McPhee, who these days is 93, and we worked together at the New Yorker, and he even made me into one of his fishing buddies. Life works in strange ways.
And you call the magazine a miracle. Why is that?
I think it's a miracle. First of all, most publications, if they're lucky, have a moment in time when they're important or they catch the zeitgeist in some way. To be on the cover of Time magazine, I needn't tell you, at a certain period in American history was an astonishing thing. Life magazine had a moment because of its visual nature that preceded television, but when TV came along, Life was eclipsed. So to have something last 100 years at a very, very high quality with the prospect of lasting a lot longer, that's something quite unusual in American culture. In newspapers, obviously, the New York Times has this. So we're celebrating a centenary year and celebrating some of the things that have been published in the past, but a lot of time has been spent thinking about what's going to be ahead for us.
You've only had 5 editors in those 100 years. Totally amazing. And I think my first encounter with the New Yorker, believe it or not, is I had a favorite book my father had called The Years with Ross by James Thurber. And it talked about Harold Ross and how his personality imprinted the DNA of the New Yorker. Tell me about that founding editor.
Well, Harold Ross was a newspaperman from out west. Like all great New Yorkers, he's somebody who made his way here
and worked on the item in New Orleans.
That's right. And I think he bounced around. He must have been in a newspaper every 6 months. He really bounced around a lot in an old style. But he came to New York and he had ideas for all kinds of things, shipping news, and then there was this one idea to have a kind of funny cosmopolitan news magazine, and mainly comic, Walter, at first, mainly comic. And he got a family, the Fleischman family, that had made money in yeast, to put a few dollars behind this cockamamie idea. And at first it was a big flop. It was not good, and it was a financial failure as well. And they almost shut the thing down. And Harold Ross, who was a bit of a card player and he was familiar with the bottle occasionally, in an all-night poker game, nearly lost the whole thing. So it's a miracle that it lasted to 1926, much less 2025.
He said this magazine wasn't for the little old lady from Dubuque.
Yeah.
I think I was reading in The Years with Ross, they had a cartoon proposed where they had to have Harold Ross go apologize to his aunt from Dubuque at a hotel. Why? What did he mean by that? And is that still what the magazine's about?
I think he meant that he wanted that magazine to be for a very particular community. It was a really, it wasn't even, the community didn't even extend to the Brooklyn or the Bronx. It was a very Manhattan jazz age idea meant to be a very small publication. It's since expanded. It's expanded in its seriousness and its reporting and its length and its ambitions. I don't think Harold Ross imagined a magazine that would break the Abu Ghraib scandal or Hiroshima by John Hersey. That came infinitely later. By the way, I just wanted on the record that I'm happy to have anyone in Dubuque reading The New Yorker. It's for whoever has eyes to see and read. So I'm much my attitude about that, I don't share with Harold Ross.
Harold Ross is succeeded by his deputy for many, many years, William Shawn, Mr. Shawn to everybody. And he did not seem to have a great sense of humor, but he had a feel for the long form, right?
He did. I mean, he was Ross's deputy for a long time. And just as Catherine Angel, who became Catherine White, introduced really top-level fiction to The New Yorker, William Shawn played an instrumental role in bringing deep reporting to The New Yorker. The apotheosis of this was John Hersey's piece about Hiroshima, Rachel Carson on pesticides, and James Baldwin on race, and so on. So it also shows you that a magazine, a publication, really any imaginative process that's not just individual, is a collection of intelligences that come together. And I think a good editor is not somebody that believes that he or she has the answer to everything and the only person who's generating ideas.
You mentioned John Hersey's Hiroshima. And I was at the New York Public Library. That's what I do for fun. And that's where your archives are. And they have a display, I'm sure you know, of all the archives. And I saw on the wall the most amazing letter. I actually took a photograph of it. And it says, "Dear Bill, do you think you could tolerate 4 parts on Hiroshima? I can't say of my material on the bombing that it's wonderful, but it is sobering, moving, and newsy." Yeah. First of all, I can't imagine anybody calling Mr. Shawn Dear Bill, but also the rest of that letter, that was an amazing leap.
It was at that time, and it's a leap that's since been taken innumerable times. You know, very often a reporter will come back from wherever he or she has been, and they have a story to tell that is beyond the imagining of any editor or even, the current media. In his case, he had witnessed something that had not been publicized at all, except in the most abstract terms. The atomic age had begun, but the human cost of it on the ground had not been seen in the United States. So we are at a point now, Walter, where still foreign journalists are not allowed into Gaza. And yet at the same time, we've seen a lot of innumerable images because of, for all the reasons we know, because of the phone and God bless them, journalists in Gaza, and bless the memory of those who have been so horribly killed. That was a different world. That was not a world of social media and videos on your phone. And Percy brought that human news to the United States, and it made international news. It had incredible resonance.
In this Netflix documentary, Tina Brown, your predecessor, plays a big role and talked about having to really kind of dust it off and sweep out some of the cobwebs. Tell me what she did.
Well, you know, you want to be careful at any given moment in time that you're not just admired, but actually read. You're right. And I think there comes a time in the life of any long-standing publication where you can fall into habits or self-satisfaction. There's no question that the New Yorker was publishing terrific things during late Sean and during Bob Gottlieb's reign, but Tina had an outsider sense of how to shake things up. We're not the same people. I don't know that we'd make absolutely every editorial decision the same. Of course not. But I work for her as a writer, and I was very much behind this idea of shaking things up. And I'll be perfectly honest, she made my life a lot easier coming in.
And so when you came in, she made your life easier maybe by shaking things up. What did you feel you had to change, and what's your mark you're putting on it?
Well, it's been 27 years, Walter, to be honest, and I might be the worst judge of whatever my term is, because I'm sort of in the thick of it in the way you don't always see backwards very well when you're looking forward all the time. But certainly one of them has to be, how did the New Yorker accommodate to the modern media age? How did it take on the internet and audio and video? Just the different velocity, and how do we exist in the world? What is our voice in it? That's all taken a lot of attention and a lot of work.
One of the tensions I saw in that Netflix thing, it was about, being very modern, but also being very traditional. And as one of your writers talking about having to quote somebody as saying, elite mother something or other.
But with the accent aigu over
and so he said, yes, they actually ran the word, but they maybe put the accent aigu on the elite.
Yeah, this is Andrew Moran's, and he says maybe by putting that accent, it proves their case that we are such, that phrase.
One of the most iconic aspects of the New Yorker is the magazine's cover, of course. And I wanted to do a clip, we'll see, of the arts editor, longtime arts editor, right? Francois Mouly, is that how you say your name?
Yeah, Francois Mouly.
Discussing what goes into deciding the cover. So here, let's look at this clip.
Sure.
Until you have the cover, you don't know what the personality of the issue is. It's not something that you can just slap on at the last minute. A cover needs to speak to the moment, but also be a timeless piece of art that should be able to be framed and put on a wall. Frankly, chasing that week after week keeps me up with anxiety even after 30 years.
What are your elements where you say, yes, that's the one?
Well, it has to work the way a grenade works, right? You can't, if you have to explain it for 5 minutes what's going on, or you have to have explanations about why this may or may not be good, it doesn't work. It has to work immediately. It has to work immediately. Now, people interpret a joke or an image in different ways, and that's fine. In fact, it's great. But if you're sort of puzzling over it, as if it were an obscure Escher drawing or something like that doesn't quite work, then there's a problem. And so Francoise and it's basically a two-person operation. She's generating ideas all the time and sketches, and then she comes to me and we discuss what we like and what we don't like. And once in a while, if I'm on the fence, I'll take that sketch around the office to, a few people that I trust or will put pressure on my presumptions and will make a decision.
One of the things that happens in this documentary is you're always walking the halls, being with people in the office, the meetings. Yeah. How important is it in this day and age to be back in the office, so to speak?
Look, I know there's lots of discussion about that in lots of workplaces, including my own, but I think it's important. I think it's important. I think it's okay that there's some more greater flexibility than there was pre-pandemic, but the act of being in the same room with somebody, of bumping into people and having casual conversations that you didn't expect to have, is infinitely better than the business of, texting someone, can we talk later? And it's just not as spontaneous, or nor is it as productive. This is a collaborative piece of work. Writing is not. Writing is some poor soul all alone in her office or room, wherever it is, trying to apply mind to the matter of what's in front of them. That's hard work. But in terms of the making of a publication, the online version daily, the weekly version, what the mix is of things, the ideas that we will be visiting 6 months or a year from now, that to me really benefits by being in rooms together with other human beings. It's amazing to think that this is under such challenge, but I think time is going to bear that out.
There aren't that many places that do this kind of super labor-intensive, super confronting journalism. I mean, they're not activists, but they are fearless when the facts support it.
One of my favorite things in New Yorker, of course, is Talk of the Town, and it's evolved. And one of the great writers was E.B. White, who mastered that art. And my favorite is something he wrote, which is, we received a letter from the Writers' War Board the other day asking for a statement on the meaning of democracy. Yeah. Now, it's a beautiful piece he writes, very sort of dry and clever, but it's also about democracy, and that still seems to be one of the causes of the New Yorker.
It absolutely is, and I'm glad you brought that up because look, I watch your show, and I think you would say the same of your program, is that democracy, to say the very, very least, is under great challenge now. It's under great challenge from, above all, the President of the United States. And that's not just something to say, that's something to do rigorous journalism about, fair-minded, rigorous, accurate journalism. But democratic institutions are, including your own, by the way, public television, are under assault. And we are duty-bound as a democratic institution ourselves to stand up for it and do the work that we're supposed to be doing at the highest level, tirelessly, and without compromise. And when I say without compromise, I don't mean once, just kind of in some sort of vitriolic way, but to do the work of reporting. I was on a panel about journalism the other day, and I looked around and I realized that the lion's share of people at the table were not anybody that had taken out a notebook in 10 years. They had things to say. They were commentators. They were talking heads. They were comedians. But at the heart of this enterprise of journalism is reporting, finding out what is true, what is hidden, and bringing it to light, and applying the real standards of truth as best you can in a given time. Knowing all the while you will fail at times. You will fail. And we should be honest about our failures as well. But that is at the center of our work, too. We're not the only ones, to be sure, not even remotely. But that's my, if that sounds sanctimonious, then I don't really care.
David Remnick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Now, is society experiencing a crisis of masculinity? Our next guest argues that a host of cultural and economic issues have promoted unhealthy perceptions of masculinity, resulting in toxic behaviors and relationships. NYU professor and podcast host Scott Galloway joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss his new book, concentrating on where conversations around masculinity have gone wrong.
Biana, thanks. Scott Galloway, thanks so much for joining us. You just wrote a book called Notes on Being a Man, about the crisis affecting young boys and men. And on a recent podcast, you said, no group has fallen faster in America than young men. Lay out the kind of problem case for us. Why is this book necessary for young men today? I mean, why aren't they being prioritized?
Hari, always good to see you. Thanks for having me. So the data is pretty stark. If you go into a morgue and there's 5 people who've died by suicide, 4 are men. They're 3 times more likely to be addicted, 3 times more likely to be homeless. So when we say we have a homeless problem and an addiction problem, it would be fair to say we have a male homeless and a male addiction problem. 1 in 7 men are now referred to as NEETs, and that is neither employed in education or in training. Only 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 is in a relationship, and 2 in 3 women under the age of 30 are in a relationship. And you think, well, that's mathematically impossible. It's not, because women are dating older because they want more economically and emotionally viable men. And the result is, I believe, that we're slowly but surely producing or evolving a new breed of, or a new species of asocial, asexual males. It's as if we're planning our own extinction. And if you look at the most violent, looking to the ramifications here, if you look at the most violent, unstable society in the world, they have a preponderance of one thing: a disordinate amount of young men with a lack of economic or romantic opportunities. So I think it's a real problem. And unfortunately, I think that the unearned privilege of men of my generation has resulted in a lack of empathy for young men who don't have the same opportunities that I had.
You kind of break down parts of your code into 3 roles that men should be playing. They should protect, provide, and procreate. Break that down for us.
Well, I think in a capitalist society, and we're not talking about, not necessarily about the way the world should be, but the way it is, I think men need to be economically viable. And I think a decent place to start as a man is to bring the focus and energy and discipline and pursue certification such that you can be economically viable. Show the discipline that you can make some money and save more than you spend, and assume that you should take economic responsibility, which is sometimes means to get out of the way and be more supportive of your partner who might be better at this whole money thing. Because I think, unfortunately, our society disproportionately evaluates women on their aesthetics, and it disproportionately evaluates men on their economic viability. But the whole shooting match, the whole reason you get strong, smart, certified, and establish some prosperity is that your default operating system should be to move to protection. And that is, if you think about the most masculine jobs, whether it's a fireman, a cop, or someone in the military, at the end of the day, what they're really doing is protecting. And Hari, I know you have kids. I feel most at ease and most as if I have purpose when I know my kids are safe, my partner feels noticed, and I feel good about myself. I protect my family, and then I can move to protecting the community, protecting the country. And then the ultimate expression of masculinity, I think, is to plant trees, the shade of which you won't sit under. And then the final thing is procreation. And this is more controversial, but I stand by it. I think we have pathologized men's interest in romantic and sexual relationships when it should be celebrated. And that is that fire of wanting to have a relationship, wanting to have sex, wanting to have children can be channeled, and it usually is, into very positive ways. Wanting to be fit, wanting to dress well, wanting to groom, wanting to have a plan, wanting to demonstrate the ultimate secret weapon of mating from a man's perspective, in my view, and there's research to show this, have a kindness practice. So we've pathologized men's interest in romantic and sexual relationships when I think it should be celebrated as long as it's channeled the right way.
You know, when someone hears the procreate portion, the pillar here, they're going to say, well, what is the role of women in the world according to Galloway? What is his suggestion to young men on how they should interact with and perceive the other half of the species?
Well, I mentor some young men, and when I know they've come off the tracks is when they start blaming immigrants for their economic problems and when they start blaming women for the romantic problems. And to the right's credit, they recognized the problem with young men before anybody. But their solution was to conflate masculinity with coarseness and cruelty and take America back to where it was in the 50s, where non-whites and women had less opportunity. They've somehow decided that there's an inverse correlation between women's ascent and men's descent. And that's just not true. I think we have to teach our young boys that we should be celebrating, and men, our sisters and our mothers' ascent. It's absolutely wonderful. No group has ascended faster than women globally. More are seeking tertiary education than men. And I think, unfortunately, because of these algorithms and certain trends, popular trends in the media, the genders have done a great job of convincing themselves that it's the other gender's fault. A lot of men, unfortunately, in the manosphere want to blame women for their problems. Again, that's toxic and just totally incorrect. But also, quite frankly, there is a bit of a zeitgeist and an unhealthy theme online among young women that young men don't have problems, they are the problem. And also on the far right, while they conflate masculinity with coarseness and cruelty, the far left's answer to the masculinity crisis is to tell young men to act more like a woman. I don't think that's helpful either. So I think the ultimate alliance is the following. I think men protect, I think women heal, and I think together they create wonderful, happy households and more humanity. And I also feel compelled to say, Hari, that masculinity and femininity, which should be celebrated, both of them, are not sequestered to the people born as males or females. I think there's some women who demonstrate wonderful masculine features, and I think there's men that demonstrate wonderful feminine features. So let's celebrate femininity, let's celebrate masculinity, and let's restore the greatest alliance in history, and that is the alliance between men and women.
You talk a lot about your own life and the disadvantages and advantages that you had. And I can see a recent college grad watching our conversation, and when it comes to economic opportunity, they can say, you know what, I read that book, Scott, and that's pretty nice, but you were able to afford an apartment. You didn't have massive college debt hanging over your head. You didn't know whether or not AI was going to completely consolidate a lot of entry-level white-collar positions that I'm applying for today. How much of this is this disillusionment, I guess, for young men today, a circumstance of the climate that we're living in?
My response to that would be that you're 100% correct. I'll just run through it. I got assisted lunch. I got into UCLA when there was a 74% admissions rate. I was one of the 26% that didn't get in. I applied again and I got in. The admissions rate this year will be 9%. I got Pell Grants. Immigrants built my companies. I came of age during the internet. If you look at 1945 to 2000, 5% of the population in America registered a third of the economic growth globally. And then all of that massive prosperity was crammed into 1/3 of the population that was essentially white heterosexual males. Let me be clear. I had unfair, unprecedented, historic advantage, historic wind in my sails. But that's no reason to hold it. A 19-year-old is paying the price for my privilege. So we have a debt on a couple levels. One, we have an obligation to get involved in the lives of young men that aren't ours. The single point of failure for a young man coming off the tracks is when he loses a male role model. And they're super easy to find, young men without a male role model. Just ask around your office for single mothers. You don't have to be a CEO. You don't have to be an adolescent psychiatrist. Does the kid want to come over and watch a ball game with me? Would he be interested in coming over and hanging out? They are young men and boys everywhere, and it is so easy to add value. And then part of that debt also is my generation to start paying it forward or paying it back, if you will, and stop these economic policies that keep transferring wealth from young people to old. The two biggest tax deductions in our tax code are mortgage interest rate tax deduction and capital gains. Who owns homes and stocks? People my age. Who rents and makes their money from current income? Young people. They're the scariest statistic in our society right now, Hari. And the epicenter of, I think, the majority of what ails our nation is the following. For the first time in our nation's history, a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at the age of 30. These are solvable problems. Tax holidays, minimum wage of $25 an hour, national service, tax deduction on current income as opposed to capital gains, universal child credit, universal child care, which I think would help young families, the $40 billion tax credit stripped out of the infrastructure bill, the $120 billion cost of living adjustment in the Social Security plan flies right through Congress. We need to stop. Old people need to stop putting their hands in the pockets of young people. This isn't rocket science. Tax credits, 8 million homes in 10 years, bring the cost of education down, and a tax policy that is truly progressive and stops stealing from young people.
One of the things, Scott, you repeatedly talk about in the book is that young men should get offline. Why?
I wrote a book on happiness because I'm finally old enough to admit this. I struggle with anger and depression. And I think I've read every peer-reviewed research paper on happiness, and they all distill around the same thing. The key to happiness, the key to purpose is deep and meaningful relationships. And unfortunately, you have 40% of the S&P by market value has a vested interest in sequestering you and polarizing you. And what you have online is a frictionless version of life where you lack the friction to teach you skills and you lack real connection. The deepest pocketed companies with godlike technology are trying to train all of our young people, and men especially, who are especially receptive to this, that they can have a reasonable facsimile of life online. Why go through the hassle of trying to navigate the pecking order to find friends, right? Hari, you're an interesting guy. I'd like to be your friend. Let's grab drinks. That feels awkward for me to say, and it's true. Why put on a tie, try to navigate the landmine of BS that is corporate America when you can trade stocks or crypto on Coinbase or Robinhood? And why would you go through the effort of looking nice, working out, showering, smelling good, having a plan, taking risks, the expense, and develop the calluses and the resilience of risk-taking with women who are much choosier than men, such that you could have a romantic and sexual relationship of your own when you have lifelike porn? Young men need to get off of their phones, get out, touch grass, take risks, engage, and hear a lot of no's. I coach young men. 1, we're going to get fit. We're going to get strong. 2, we're going to start making some money, get a taste for flesh. If you have a smartphone, you can make some money. I don't care if it's being a Lyft driver or a TaskRabbitor, because once you get a little bit of money, you start learning how to make more. You get excited about it. And 3, we're going to put ourselves in the company of strangers. And then we're going to express friendship and ask somebody out to go see the ball game, and maybe ask someone out for coffee and exhibit the key skill, which I think every father needs to try and teach his son at a young age. How do you express romantic interest while making someone feel safe? And this is the goal. No, because there is no great thing in life. There's no real victory in life that isn't preceded by a ton of no's. You didn't show up and start doing national programs with millions of viewers. I can't tell you how many no's I have had in my life. So it's pretty simple. Get off your phone, get out, touch grass, get to know. And the more no's you get, that means a wonderful yes is waiting for you.
You talk about your dad, who passed away earlier this year, and how difficult that process was. And I wonder if just the process, the act of writing this book was hard for you, having to kind of rethink about the relationships that you had in your past with your mom, your dad. And you lay out also that his life is a cautionary tale. Why?
Yeah, this isn't an easy thing to say about your father who recently passed away. My father was not a high character person. He was married and divorced 4 times. He left his last wife when she was in late stage Parkinson's, a year away from passing away. My sister and I, my father passed away about 3 months ago. My sister and I were going to have a service for him, and then we realized nobody would come. He didn't have a single friend. So he left me and my mom when we were 8. He could have made our lives a lot easier, and he chose not to. So he was a flawed person. But what I would say is a huge unlock, not just for men, but for anybody, and has been a huge unlock in my life, is that about 20 or 30 years ago, I decided to put away the scorecard. And instead of thinking, was my dad good or not good to me, meaning that should dictate what kind of son I am, I just said, all right, what kind of son do I want to be? What kind of partner do I want to be? What kind of boss do I want to be? What kind of friend do I want to be? And then hold myself to that standard and not have a scorecard. And I decided I wanted to be a loving, generous son. And I was that. And I got huge reward out of my relationship with him the last 20 or 30 years. And also, my father checked an evolutionary box for all men, in that is he was a much better father to me, as bad as he was, than his father was to him. And he evolved and he tried to get better. But it is a cautionary tale, Hari, because as many blessings as my father had, he essentially, had it not been for his sister or for his son and his sister, he would have died under bright lights surrounded by strangers. So it's a cautionary tale that if you don't invest in relationships and you don't give of yourself and you're selfish, you run the risk of leaving this world alone and of failing And he kind of made the fatal mistake around raising children. And that is, I do believe that the best thing you can do for your sons is to treat their mother well. And my dad didn't do that.
You end your book with essentially a letter to your sons. And I guess, what do you want them to know about the relationship that you had with your parents and how that informed you as a parent to them? Because as you just talked about your dad, you're very tender with what your mom, the role that she played in your life, and especially the end of her life when you had a far greater role as really a caregiver, and which is a completely different dynamic that most kids think will never happen to them.
I'm grateful. I had my mom, when she was diagnosed with cancer for the third and final time, I moved in with her, and it's something towards the end of her life. It's something that I will cherish the rest of my life. What I want my sons to know is the following, that first and foremost, I love them immensely. And something I got from my mom is, I think if you, in small and little ways, explicitly, implicitly, tell your kids you just think they're wonderful, and my mom did that, I don't think they can help but start to believe that themselves. And I think that's the key to success, is at the end of the day, after being fired, after being rejected by a potential romantic partner, after losing money, you can look in the mirror and think, I can add value to a company, I can make someone very happy, and things will work out for me. But also to recognize that they have a debt. They have a debt. They were born in America, which gives them unprecedented agency. They were born into wealth, which means they have an obligation to ensure that the ladder is not pulled up behind them. And finally, I end the letter with the following, take care of your mom. That's it. That's the whole shooting match. That was one of the, they are the thing I'm most proud of. I'm proud of my economic security, but that's just a means. The ends is the following. And what it means to be a man is to move from prosperity to protection. And that I hope that they recognize someday that protection initially manifests itself in taking care of the mother. And then also what it really means to be a man on a broader level is what I call surplus value. Do you absorb more complaints than you complain? Do you notice people? Are you the kind of person that feels as if when someone cuts you off in traffic, you have to speed up and cut them off? When someone is rude to you at the ticket counter at Delta, and I'm describing me as a younger man, and I'm not proud of this, do you feel you need to get back in their face to restore harmony to the universe because you're so damn important? When you get to the point where you notice more people's lives than you notice your own, you create more economic value than you absorb, you listen to more complaints, you break up more fights than you start, you add surplus value. That's what it means to be a man, and that's what I hope for my boys. And again, see above, take care of your mother.
Entrepreneur, podcaster, and author, Scott Galloway. Thanks so much. The book is called Notes on Being a Man.
Thank you, Ari.